October 21st, 2015, Back to the Future Day, and this is KVIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are two of my Missouri School of Journalism colleagues, Mike McKean and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, Ebony Magazine's controversial cover have the sexual assault claims against Bill Cosby shattered the Huxtable family's image. Some Cincinnati Bengals got caught with their pants down during post-game coverage on the NFL Network, and they're not happy about it. We'll talk about why they're now calling for a change to locker room policies. There's a whole lot more that hopefully we'll get to as well, but I want to start with what can only be described as a fight between finger pointers. There are other ways that I could describe it, but I'm not so sure I should be using that term in polite company, so use your imagination. Remember in August, we told you about that expose the New York Times ran on life inside Amazon's corporate offices? It went into detail describing cutthroat business practices, enticements for employees to work around the clock, to rat each other out. Well, company spokesman and Vice President Jay Carney spoke out against that story at the time, saying it wasn't accurate and didn't properly portray the corporate culture. At the time, we described his response as spin, deftly carried out by one of the best spin doctors out there. And for 2 months, we pretty much forgot about it until yesterday. Mike, what happened that brought attention back to this?
Well, so Jay Carney goes on Medium, an online site, to post his detailed response because he claimed that the New York Times was not willing to correct the story or to listen to them, so they aired their point of view. And the point of view is basically that the New York Times didn't give us a chance to respond to the named sources. Some of the named sources and what they claimed maybe weren't everything that was made out to be, or at least they weren't the model citizens, and that they didn't represent all of the wonderful people who worked at Amazon. Well, I think there are some aspects of that that are, true and some that aren't, but the New York Times wasn't going to let that go unresponded to, and so the executive editor, Dean Baquet, goes on to Medium as well and puts his response out there, basically saying, hey, look, we based this story on dozens and dozens of interviews. There were thousands of comments online that backed up the portrayal that we gave of Amazon. And, we didn't try to fool you as to the kind of story we were doing. And so that's led to the debate.
Well, I think part of this is that back and forth again, and I think Amazon feels as if its image was shattered or
tarnished in some way.
Yeah, and they're going to go after this because I think it is the New York Times, and what they want, they want the New York Times to come out with something either on the front page or something prominent on its website saying that there were issues with the story and we apologize for those issues. And the New York Times is not going to do that because they're saying that, look, we have gone through our fact checking and we stand by our story, and the fact that the comments that are coming in from others who have read the story, who also work at Amazon, are saying the same thing. They're confirming some of the things we're saying, and I think they're not going to back off.
And I have to go. I went back and read the story again because I definitely believe that it was a nuanced, tough but fair story when we talked about it a month or so ago, and I still think it is. I do think that Jay Carney, former presidential spokesman, great spinmeister, had a couple of legitimate complaints. I'm not saying he's right, but it is something we ought to talk about. So first of all, why didn't, and Dean Baquet didn't really say otherwise, why didn't they go to Amazon and seek comment on the named quotes that were in that piece before they ran it? They probably should have. And two, even though they excerpted a piece of it, they showed an email, Amazon did, from one of the New York Times reporters working on this, basically saying, hey, this isn't going to be a tough hatchet job piece. We're not out to air all your dirty laundry. We want to show a nuanced and balanced approach to how people say that this is a great place to work, but it's also a hard place to work. Okay. Why, if that's true, it says something about how the news media and reporters generally try to soft sell when they're working on a hard story so that the subject of the story doesn't get out ahead of it, try to counterspin before the story runs. And that letter or email did seem to suggest that what the story the New York Times was really planning on doing was not the story that they described to Amazon in the email.
Well, I think you make some good points there. I went back and I read that as well. And I think what's happening here is that that Amazon was kind of expecting the story to be somewhat harsh, but I don't think that they were expecting to get the kind of criticism that they received after the story came out from others. I think they were willing to probably deal with the story once it came out, but the comments both to the New York Times and to Amazon itself on its website by others is something that they weren't ready for, and this is their response to that.
Well, the New York Times might not be backing down, but you know who is? Fox News, and specifically Neil Cavuto. Friday night, he issued an apology following the arrest of Wayne Simmons, an expert the cable news network had on pretty regularly because of his experience as a CIA operative. Simmons was arrested on Thursday and charged with using a false CIA claim to gain government security clearance and a position with a defense contractor.
Now, if it's true that all our due diligence and vetting on Mr. Simmons missed this, that's big, and that's on me, and only me. And you as viewers have little reason to be comforted by the excuse that Mr. Simmons might, and I stress might, have fooled many others, including no less than former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. But the responsibility to check out who comes on this show ultimately lies with me. After all, it's my Italian name on it. I'm in charge of it. I decide who comes on it. If in so doing I wasn't thorough enough or followed up enough, it's on me, and I apologize. You have a right to expect guests who appear here to be who they say they are here. Now, it's a very rare slip-up, but it's a very big slip-up, and I will make doubly sure something like this never, ever happens again. I value your trust, and I promise to work very hard to regain it.
So Neil Cavuto's role at Fox News does go deeper than most of the anchors there. He is also a senior vice president, so maybe that responsibility does rest with him.
I think it does, but this isn't the first time that Fox has been, and others have been caught using people who make these claims about their expertise, and then you go and do a little digging and find out that they aren't who they say they are. I think what's different here is that the government has actually gone after this person because they tried to get security clearance to work with contractors, and once they started digging, they're like, whoa, wait a minute, you know, this guy who he's claiming to be is not who he is. But there's another part to this story that I think goes back even further, is that, you know, he is actually saying things that people in the military-industrial complex, they like to hear this thing because it works for them, especially when you start talking about the war on terror and how much we're engaged in this, which can lead back to defense contractors, which leads back to government contracts. So it's all a part of the whole system that's at work here.
Well, I would say first, one of the things we always do is dissect apologies, because there are plenty of them.
We do have our fair share to keep coming back to.
And I will say that Neil Cavuto's apology seemed straightforward and sincere. I don't know if it was sincere, but it seemed that way. He didn't really mince any words. I mean, he did say that other people had been fooled, but he took responsibility. So good for him. That doesn't mean that Fox News or his show is absolved, responsibility. I will say this, however, here's a guy who for more than 10 years has been on Fox News, and primarily only on Fox News, talking about being a CIA analyst and all this sort of stuff. The CIA had lots of time to say this guy's not for real if they wanted to do that. And the federal government's prosecutors have been looking into whether or not he falsified claims to get this government contracting job. That's been going on for a while now, too. Why all of a sudden are they coming out and prosecuting him? So I think there's a whole lot more to learn about this story before we draw any official conclusions.
But I also find it hard to believe that he's been under investigation for this long, and Fox News has not said, wait a minute, maybe we need to stop and take a look at this and see whether or not there's some truth behind this. But, he was doing what, in terms of providing information and providing a point of view that Fox wanted to hear.
There you go. He provided a point of view. One of the things that's interesting, too, is that Fox spokespeople have come out and said he was not a contributor. He was a regular guest, but not a contributor. The delineation there being that Fox pays its contributors and that no money had exchanged hands.
And I get that, and I don't think that really cuts a lot
in my
of
opinion,
ice.
I don't think it really means much.
But every other cable news outlet and a lot of the TV broadcast networks also have paid consultants or regular guests that aren't being paid. And as Ernest was suggesting, this is a really big problem for all of them. I thought there was an interesting quote in the CNN Money piece you got on our Links blog about this, basically saying the news industry trusts these individuals in part because of their own self-promotion and past media appearances. So we're not doing a lot to vet them, and we're kind of this unvirtuous cycle, so to speak, that keeps these people on the air. And as you pointed out too, the New York Times ran a piece several years ago now that basically says most of these people have something to do with the military-industrial complex. They often represent the point of view of the administration in power. I mean, this guy Simmons was invited by Donald Rumsfeld when he was defense secretary to come to the Pentagon and talk to government officials, military officials, about how to deal with the media. So this is a problem that's much deeper than this one guy or this one network.
And I think it also falls into the thing that we talk about all the time about the cable news networks continually need to bring people on to fill airtime and to have a certain point of view that matches with whoever is hosting that particular show and what the topic of of the day is going to be and that sort of thing. And this sort of goes into what we're about to talk about in terms of Donald Trump and CNBC and that sort of thing, because it's what happens when you have these downtimes in cable news where not very much is going on and you've got to generate news.
So let's go ahead and talk about that. You know those OSHA signs, the ones that say this many days since a workplace injury? Well, our sign might be this many weeks without talking about Donald Trump. Reset it to 0, because we are going to talk about how he and Ben Carson teamed up to pretty much bully CNBC into holding the next GOP debate on their terms. What went on here?
It's pretty much exactly as you described it. I mean, CNBC is hosting one of the debates. They wanted to set some rules for the debate that would say no opening and closing comments, and we're going to take, well, somewhere between 2 and 3 hours to do this debate, including commercials. Well, Trump didn't do so well in those debates. Carson didn't do so well in the second debate. So surprise, surprise, they say that they're not going to show up, or they're threatening not to show up unless those rules get changed. The other candidates were also not all that thrilled about the ground rules, but Trump and Carson got to take credit for it on social media. And sure enough, CNBC backs down. Now it's going to be a 2-hour debate, going to be opening and closing statements. It's going to be just like all those other non-debates where we're going to have a lot of spin and not a whole lot of honest debate.
And this goes back to CNBC wants to be in the game. CNN had their debate. Fox had their debate. Now CNBC gets to have its debate. Everybody's having a debate to fill airtime. And you know they're drawing decent numbers, but in reality, it's just playing to the crowd.
Well, and they're drawing decent numbers, but I would have to think on some level there's going to be a law of diminishing returns. With each of these subsequent debates, fewer and fewer people are going to be watching.
And I think that's one of the reasons why CNBC wanted to have a different style of debate, so that you could really keep it interesting, maybe get to some of the issues and not to some of the sort of pandering that's been going on. But that's what the candidates want. They want it to be sort of like a campaign stop and not an actual
And we
debate.
were talking yesterday, Ernest, about how CNBC is really struggling to get that primetime audience, that reruns of ABC's Shark Tank aren't going to do it for CNBC, and that this is an opportunity perhaps to draw some viewers into those primetime hours, even if it's a one-off.
And I guarantee you, if Donald Trump wasn't on that stage, those numbers would crater. I mean, there wouldn't be much of an audience for it. So Trump had him, you know, and he played it for everything it was worth.
And it sort of fits in with what Trump wants to do in this election, or to be able to stay in this election. It fits in for Ben Carson because they're outsiders. They're not establishment candidates. And as we move closer to those first nominating
the first primaries and caucuses.
once we move closer to that, you're going to start to see the establishment take more and more aggressive stance to try to deal with this sort of outsider threat.
But right now, let the circus play itself out.
Let the circuit play itself out.
Well, there are some people who are pretty upset about the new cover of Ebony magazine, Behind Shattered Glass, insinuating the sexual assault allegations against comedian Bill Cosby has tarnished the comedian and the legacy of the Huxtables, his famous TV family. As a matter of coincidence, Cosby kid Malcolm Jamal Warner appeared on The View promoting his new musical album. Joy Behar asked him about it.
We really don't have enough time on this show to really talk about how I feel about that.
It's kind of a fractured picture of the family, right?
Sure.
It's fractured. let's not forget that The Cosby Show was a sitcom and not a reality show. Let's just remember that this was a sitcom. We had writers and things of that nature.
You know, there's things about that show that are nobody's ever going to take away from you. You know, it was a pioneering show. It broke ceilings for African Americans, and I think it's got to be viewed in a silo. And you know, and you both need to be very proud of everything that show represents.
Thank you. And I think that's a show that we're all very proud to have been on. And Keisha Pulliam said a really interesting thing in that her perspective is the legacy cannot be taken away because all of the good that show has done cannot be taken away. The generation of people of color who have chosen to go to college because they watched that show and because they watched Different World, you can't take that away. And I think that was a really good point that Keisha made.
You heard that female voice talking about The Cosby Show being a scripted sitcom. That was View's co-host and Cosby grandkid, if you will, Raven-Symoné. And clearly you can see both Raven-Symoné and Malcolm Jamal Warner kind of uncomfortable with the whole thing. Why the cover? CNN's Don Lemon asked the magazine's editor-in-chief.
The fact remains we've got to have the conversation.
That's the point of it, isn't it?
That's the entire point of it. And, you know, someone asked me earlier, why are you guys being so fearless and how is Ebony being so fearless? Quite frankly, I'm not sure if it's fearlessness or if it's a willingness to confront our fears.
So then what is the conversation that we must have, as you said?
Well, first of all, we must ask the questions, the big loaded questions.
Right.
Should we separate the man from the
fictional character, right?
The fictional character who we all exalted, loved, needed, in some respects, worshipped, the idea behind, the notion behind.
So we have a teaser to that full article that's on the Links blog. It can begin to give you the tone of what comes in that. Though the scuttlebutt is that it's a lot more nuanced than what that cover in the teaser might lead you to believe.
Yeah, there's a lot more complexity to this story and a lot more complexity to the legacy of the Cosby Show because it premiered and had its heyday in a time when in the African American community things were pretty dicey. I mean, you had the AIDS epidemic was going on, you had the crack epidemic going on, you had images on other television shows, and especially in media outlets where African Americans were not seen in a positive light. I mean, there was a whole talk about unwed mothers and crack babies and that sort of thing. So when Cosby comes out and it's reflecting something that's different, something that's much more mainstream, it gives you much more of a positive light. And now in today's reality, you see what's happening with Bill Cosby. We've talked about that on the show over and over again. How do you place that show in a more historical, contextual way in light of what's happening with Cosby right now? And that is a conversation that really needs to be had.
Mike, I saw you kind of making some faces as Raven-Symoné was making her comment.
You know, the clips that you showed, I think, tell us something about the strengths and weaknesses of the approaches that different media take to covering this story. The View, it was all about focusing on celebrity. It wasn't about the issues that were being raised by the magazine. It wasn't about a detailed discussion about the decisions that were being made. The interview that Don Lemon did with the editor, I thought, and I watched that whole thing, it was very interesting, and it did get into why they decided to do what they did. This was their annual family issue. It was a great way to get into that story. You can't just ignore the debate that's been going on in the public at large or in the African American community for the past year over the Cosby allegations. And I just thought that, I don't know if it's, we haven't read the article. I haven't seen the article anyway. It's not out yet. But it seems to me that this was a pretty heroic stance on their part, or at least an attempt to frame the issue in a way that would get more people to talk about it in ways they might not have talked about it.
And I think that, that Ebony is really good at tackling this issue, mainly because it hasn't done this kind of thing in a very long time. The editor that Don Lemon interviewed, she's only been on the job 5 months. She wants to take Ebony in another direction to deal with the tough issues that are going on in the African American community now, and there's probably not any tougher issue going on right now other than Black Lives Matter than this issue right here.
So there are people who are calling it brave. At the time, if you'll remember when Bill Cosby was still giving interviews, he was calling on the black press, in his words, to remain neutral on the issue and on the story. A lot of people think that his call for neutrality was actually a plea to not cover it. Yeah. Is this Ebony really doing its job, or is this an act of bravery and heroism?
I think Ebony's doing its job.
Yeah, I mean, I would have personally that same feeling, frankly.
I mean, I think that Ebony chose to tackle an issue to provide context, but to also show the complexity of how do we as people of color deal with this, and American society in general, because Cosby not only reflected what some people wanted to see in the African American community, but it also reflected what people wanted to see in family life in general. And that's one of the things that I think people really are starting to sort of question about. Well, wait a minute, what actually is family? I mean, and we talked a lot about that on this show and across the country in terms of, are we talking about the nuclear family? Are we talking about the gay family now that we dealt with marriage equality? I mean, so all those issues are coming out, and I think Ebony is looking at it from a very unique and I could be well done perspective. I hadn't read the article yet, and I'm really interested in reading it.
And had they not done the cover, a lot fewer people would be talking about this story than they're talking about it now, and probably will read the story as a result of that cover.
But I hope people will go past the cover and actually read the story. That's my fear, is that they won't do that.
What I'm hoping to be able to do soon, too. So here's a question for you. Who would play you in the movie of your life? Dan Rather now knows it's going to be Robert Redford.
Tonight, we have new information on the president's military service.
Here's to a great story.
Hey, Mary, these blogs are saying that the memos can be recreated in Microsoft Word.
Several experts have raised serious questions.
They're going to start an investigation.
This is bad.
They do not get to do this. They do not get to smack us just for asking the question.
They want to talk to your source.
No, it's bad.
That was an excerpt from the film Truth. It tells the story of Dan Rather's downfall at CBS, a 2004 report on 60 Minutes 2 that George W. Bush received preferential treatment back in the 1970s while serving in the Texas Air National Guard. There's some question as to just how much truth is in the movie Truth.
This is really a story that makes me sad and angry at the same time. And first of all, that trailer would suggest to you that this was a fair and balanced account of this whole controversy, but from people who've actually seen the movie, we're given a preview of it, it's basically a typical sort of liberal defense of Dan Rather and Mary Mapes, his producer, who did this story. And Robert Redford is very sympathetically playing Dan Rather. But you know what? Despite all of that, the truth of the matter is that they did this story about Bush and the Texas Air National Guard based on really sketchy primary source, using documents, at least one of them, which probably was faked, and they rushed that story onto the air without vetting it properly in time to try to affect the presidential election. And so it doesn't really matter how much they want to spin this in the movie. There was an independent investigation. There's a link you can find in one of the articles on our blog about that. Read it for yourself and see if it's any different now than it was all those years ago when it was being investigated at the time. CBS did the right thing in having an investigation. We can argue about whether or not they should have fired Mapes or whether they should have demoted Rather and sort of forced him off the air eventually. But what happened, happened. And this movie is from everything I've read about it, is a whitewash of what really happened.
Well, I haven't seen the movie. I've only seen the trailers. And
it's a limited release. It opened on a limited release. It's not playing in this area yet, or even if it will, but did open in select cities last weekend.
I agree with everything that Mike just said. I mean, this is one of those things where you have a Hollywood portrayal of one version of the story that fits into a narrative that Dan Rather and Mapes pretty much created. Dan Rather filed suit against CBS and basically saying, wrongful termination, even though he supposedly resigned. I mean, you've got all of these things going on, and now you've got this movie coming out, and what's going to happen is that, especially in a presidential election year, you're going to have this whole conservative, liberal back and forth. The news media is more liberal, and here's more proof of it. Hollywood is liberal, here's more proof of it, when in fact you know, if they were going to do this movie, they probably should have really played it up more along the lines of what CBS did and show the other side as well. And they didn't do that, at least from what I'm hearing. And like I said, we haven't seen the movie yet.
Well, and the movie is based on Mapes' memoir, so that sets some of that up right there.
And by the way, good for CBS for deciding not to
to
allow
take any
ads
advertising.
for that movie.
So last week we talked about Playboy deciding to drop nude photos in its magazines. And because we believe in equal opportunity, this week we're going to talk about male nudity on TV that isn't meant to be there. Yep, there was a really big whoops. The NFL Network ran a taped interview with Adam Jones in the Cincinnati Bengals locker room. There were a number of other players in the background in the buff. Bengals offensive lineman, one of those caught without pants, he says he's offended and it's time the NFL changes its locker room policies to keep reporters out. He claims that the 10-minute cooling off period between the end of a game and when reporters are allowed into a locker room to begin interviews just isn't enough, that players should be granted more privacy.
Well, I mean, I think he's got a point here. I mean, someone should have caught that. I mean, someone, you know,
yeah,
if you're
photographer should be looking through that viewpoint, that viewfinder.
Yeah, I mean, if you're
seeing naked men behind him.
Right. If you're going to come into any locker room, whether it's NFL or women's soccer, if you're going to come into a locker room with a camera, you need to look around to take a look. Okay, is everyone covered before you turn the camera on? And not to have done that, that's to me is just egregious. You really need to do that.
I agree with that, and I agree that the players, the individual players, you've got to feel for them. They had no idea, most of them, what was going on. On the other hand, I'd feel a little more sympathetic toward the league if they and other sports leagues, professional and at the college level, weren't doing everything they can today to manage the message, to restrict journalists' access. We've talked about that a lot, and I find it kind of sweetly ironic that here it was the NFL Network's
network, yeah,
that was responsible for this.
You know, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is there aren't all that many alternatives around this. If you were to set up an interview room and ask players to come out and speak to the media, they're not going to do it on a day where maybe they have a bad game or they want to rush out to go home. That sometimes that's the only way for the reporter to get the story.
Well, I know in certain instances, like during Super Bowl week and during the playoffs, the NFL will basically say, look, you have to talk to the media. If not, we will fine you. If they want to extend that to the entire season and do that same thing and then set up a place and a time to do that, then I think that would be the way to do it. The problem is you may have some players who go like, hey, you know, I'm just going to pay the fine this week because I just don't want to deal with it.
Well, that music means we're pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about. There are links on our blog. Find that under the Programs tab at kbia.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave us comments or questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show. Maya Jackson is our technical director. KBIA's Pat Akers handled the audio for us today, and Sule is our associate producer. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.